Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and this is now the third draft of this stupid goddamn video because the first time I was very confused and inarticulate, and I didn't want to release a second video on the same day that wasn't particularly well thought out. And then the second time, I spent 10 minutes talking to a microphone that wasn't on. So, hopefully, Satan willing, the this will go well and I won't have to record any more drafts. So in this video, I wanted to respond to a common critique of atheism made generally by theists that haven't spent a lot of time investigating epistemology and that haven't interacted a lot with the atheist community, which I want to say is fairly understandable because nobody can study everything, nobody can interact with every group, and although I think that if you were religious, it would behoove you to investigate all sides of the discussion regarding religion, since it is the most important proposition in your life and purports and will govern your entire life. It's understandable that some people just haven't found the time to investigate epistemology or discuss things with atheists. And this accusation or criticism of atheism is the idea that atheism is invalid or an irrational position because you can't prove that God doesn't exist. So the common response to this, of course, is for atheists to merely clarify that they are weak or agnostic atheists. Atheists that merely lack the belief in God, lack, in essence, sufficient reason to believe in the proposition that God is true, and they are not therefore claiming that they actually believe the opposite proposition that God does not exist. Of course, this might not be satisfying to some theists, and so that's why I'm going to continue the video beyond merely stating that. I want to go into the reasons why agnostic atheists, function epistemologically as we do, and explore where this confusion stems from. And actually, I want to do the latter one first, since that's a little bit of a less technical discussion. So the reason I think that many theists are confused about what atheists actually believe in regards to God's existence is because the position that you don't believe a proposition is true is quite similar to the proposition that you believe that another proposition is false. In essence, the position that you don't believe God exists is similar in outward-facing manner to the position that you believe God does not exist. The reason is that in both cases, if one believes a proposition false, you are obviously not going to factor that proposition into your belief system and hence actions. And likewise, if you don't believe a proposition is true, you are likewise not going to factor it into your belief system or actions. This is generally illustrated by atheists as pointing out that if someone asks you if you believe in Santa, you generally say no. If someone asks you, does Santa exist, you're generally going to say no, even though you actually have no evidence to disprove the possible conceivable existence of Santa. You only have a lack of evidence and the fact that no one else believes, right? And this is because, in general, a lack of belief in the truth of a proposition functions almost exactly the same as the belief that that proposition is actively false. The difference is that there are some things that someone who lacks the belief in the truth of a proposition cannot do that someone who believes the opposite of a proposition can do. For instance, someone who believes the opposite of a proposition is true can actually, present evidence, proofs, and demonstrations to that effect, which is generally much more convincing both to them and everyone else. Whereas someone who merely lacks a belief in the truth of a proposition can only essentially criticize the evidence put forward by those who actually believe in the truth of that proposition. This is generally where the stereotype of atheists just being, negative, skeptical Nellies comes from as well. Because in a sense we are, right? We're merely denying the professions of theists. We are not generally presenting arguments of our own. And the reason is that we actually do not hold the proposition that no God exists. Furthermore, like another thing that specifically agnostic atheists cannot do that a Gnostic atheist could do, if a Gnostic atheist actually had a good argument that was definitive on their side, would be to actively deny the premise of Pascal's wager. See, an agnostic atheist that merely hasn't seen a rational reason to believe the proposition that a God exists can argue against Pascal's wager on the basis of the many gods objection, or several other objections, right? Whereas a Gnostic atheist who actively believes that a God does not exist or cannot exist could actually simply deny Pascal's wager by saying, there is no God, so this is not a wager I need to make. I know I'm correct. Instead of appealing to the possibility of making the wrong wager no matter which religion you choose, which is what constitutes the many gods objection. This distinction is important, actually, because just like the active proposition that God does exist requires evidence, so too the active proposition that God does not exist requires evidence. Meanwhile, the position that of just not believing or accepting either of those propositions does not itself require evidence. It is, in fact, what is called in science and statistics the null hypothesis. Basically, in science and statistics, the null hypothesis is the default position when making statements about statistical groups. Basically, it's the position that whatever difference has been found between two or more statistical groups is a result of observational or mathematical error or something along those lines. And one actually has to overcome the null hypothesis by demonstrating positively that there actually is a difference between these statistical groups. Likewise, in epistemology, what I call the null hypothesis is the idea that if you are making a proposition that you believe is true, such as that God exists or does not exist, you actually have to provide evidence to overcome the default position that we don't know, and shouldn't act on the basis of either one, or shouldn't integrate either one into our belief system. And the reason that we have a null hypothesis, and such a stronger null hypothesis in epistemology, at least in my epistemology, is that if one were to hold that one could integrate a proposition into one's belief system as true without sufficient evidence for the truth of that proposition, then of course the problem is that there are an infinite number of insufficiently or not at all evidenced propositions. There are an infinite number of them, and an infinite number of possibly contradictory such propositions, including both of the two God-related ones. And so if one were to accept one proposition without sufficient evidence, then you'd have to accept all of the other propositions that don't have sufficient evidence. And so you're placed in the position not only of holding and integrating into your belief system an infinite number of contradictory propositions, you're also placed in the position of having to attempt to construct an infinite number of propositions in order to integrate them into your belief system in the first place. And so not only is this a contradictory position, but it's an untenable and impossible position. And so, of course, to solve this, you have to wait for sufficient evidence to believe a proposition. Moreover, since the purpose of a proposition is to describe the reality in which one exists, if there's no evidence for a proposition, then either it's because the proposition doesn't represent reality, or because you merely haven't encountered the portion of reality that that proposition describes. In either case, before you do encounter, if you do, such a portion of reality, you can't differentiate between these two, and it can be damaging to adopt a proposition on the basis that it describes a part of reality that you've just not run into yet, if it turns out to be a false proposition, especially if it makes predictions about reality that you will come into contact with, or which you already have come into contact with, which is another reason why, on a pragmatic basis, the null hypothesis should be to refuse to integrate a proposition that is insufficiently evidenced. And I'll talk in another video about setting Bayesian priors and Bayesian reasoning and so on, about how to relatively assess whether different hypotheses and propositions have enough evidence for them. I've done a little bit of this already in my epistemology series by talking about the different good criteria for belief, but there were some things in there that I want to clarify and improve on. So while I recommend that you watch that video, it's in the experientialism playlist, by the way. It's not complete and doesn't represent my most up-to-date views. So moving on. I've explained why the null position is the default position, why it has to be. And I've explained that atheists are actually holding the null position. But I've explained that they are, but I haven't explained why atheists hold the null hypothesis regarding claims of the existence of a God. And the reason why is because a God is an inherently unfalsifiable claim. Therefore, there could be no evidence or reasoning that one could propose that could actually eliminate a God, therefore actually providing evidence for the truth of the proposition that a God does not exist, and making Gnostic atheism a reasonable position to hold. So why is a God an unfalsifiable position? Well, you see, the thing about gods in general is that they are defined in whatever terms is necessary to remove them from whatever realm of inquiry might provide falsification for them. Additionally, because our conceptions of gods are generally derived from Scripture, and Scripture can be variously and almost infinitely interpreted in a sort of, Laffy-Taffy sort of way, religious people generally take their God and post hoc interpret it to fit, or at least be outside the range of, whatever we learn about the universe. So with both of those things in place, the religious God can, become the world champion hide and seek master, where no matter what test you come up with to test whether a God exists, religious people could either interpret the result of that test to be in line with the existence of a God, or merely interpret the God in such a way that that test has no longer any relation to that God. This, I think, is ultimately why the theological conception of a God has been reduced to a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, because being timeless and spaceless, it's essentially outside of the range of any evidence that we could ever provide for it, and being a disembodied, infinite, omniscient mind, its motivations and actions are inherently incomprehensible to us, such that we could actually never derive predictions about what it would do from what we know about it, since we cannot even conceive of it, therefore meaning that it makes no necessary predictions and can be post hoc fit to any evidence we want in order to make it seem as if it's making posterior predictions about everything, which I discussed in my video on why God is not a good explanation for things. And a good example, a good story to illustrate what I mean by this process, or how this process works, is Carl Sagan's Invisible Dragon analogy, which he made in The Demon Haunted World, which I have not actually read. I've only read excerpts from it, and I dearly wish that I could have my ability to read back, since listening to philosophy books on audiobook is actually far less productive than one would expect, or actually about as productive as one would expect, especially for someone like me who's not a auditory learner. So basically the analogy goes like this. If someone tells you that they have a dragon in their garage, you're obviously going to be like, oh, yeah, let me see, right? And so they bring you over to the garage, and they open the garage door, and you don't see anything. You just see an empty garage. And so you say, well, where's the dragon? And the person's obviously going to say, well, it's an invisible dragon. So you're like, okay. But if it's invisible, I can still touch it. And they're like, sure. And so you go over and you try to touch it, and your hand goes through the space that he's telling you the dragon's in. And so the other person will be like, well, no. It's an invisible and incorporeal dragon. And then, you can continue on like this. You say, well, it still has to eat, right? And then, it's an invisible, incorporeal, self-sufficient dragon. And, you ask where it came from, and they'll say, well, it's actually an incoherent question to ask where this dragon came from, because the dragon is eternal and, necessary. And on it goes. And eventually, the more questions you ask about the dragon, the more specific features of the dragon are stripped away, and the less of an individual concept it is, and the more it looks like the God concept. Because the God concept, at least at this point in theological history, is really two things. On the one hand, for apologists, it is essentially a idea which is specifically created to be minimally falsifiable, or minimally verifiable and completely unfalsifiable. And then it also consists of the other component, which is the specific religious component, which is definitely verifiable or falsifiable, makes specific statements about what it will do, such as the Christian God promising to answer all prayers, and so on and so forth. And it has specific beliefs and positions on homosexuality and sword fighting and different what clothes men should wear, and how long their hair should be, and what their beards should look like, and whether to mix fabrics, and how not to or how to boil a baby goat. Quick tip: don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, apparently. And how to breed sheep. If you breed sheep in front of striped sticks, they'll become stripy. All these things, highly specific things that it's very odd to derive from a eternal, omniscient, spaceless, timeless, disembodied mind that is incomprehensible to human understanding, right? And the reason you have these two different definitions is because of exactly the process I described, of trying to defend a theistic God and finding that it makes certain predictions and trying to avoid the result of that. This is also why the existence of God has gone from, something that's, above us and around us and constantly acting and doing miracles, to something which just kind of holds the planets together because Newtonian physics can't explain why the planets don't go flying apart, and then eventually God that just, kickstarts the universe. And so, because God, as defined by theists, is necessarily unfalsifiable and minimally verifiable, that's why it's impossible to actually hold the Gnostic atheist position. So, because as long as you can define something that people would coherently be willing to call a God, which cannot be falsified, then you can't hold the atheist position that no gods exist. Furthermore, it's actually even difficult to hold the Gnostic atheist position with regards to the second component gods, which are defined in terms of specific religious implications, because religious texts can be infinitely reinterpreted or ignored or cherry-picked at will as well, in order to avoid their falsifiable interpretations when inconvenient. and they can construct a Christian-like God that is unfalsifiable, then obviously you can't rule it out either. So this is sort of why the "you can't prove that God doesn't exist" objection doesn't really work. As it's like, well, if you're making a positive claim, you're the one that actually has to substantiate it, because you can't base a coherent epistemology on believing propositions without any evidence or without sufficient evidence. But since religions have made their gods minimally verifiable, in that they don't really make any non-post hoc predictions, it's hard for them to demonstrate the reality of their God. And, for Gnostic atheists, since religious people have defined their God in a way that's unfalsifiable, it's also hard to demonstrate the non-existence of a God. And so the really only epistemologically coherent position is just to remain on the null hypothesis. And, there are mitigating factors to this. There are some general intuitive predictions that the existence of a God, even, the minimally verifiable one, might make, that seem to be falsified, therefore decreasing the probability that a God exists. This is discussed in Sean Carroll's talk, Why God is Not a Good Theory, which is in my recommended videos playlist, and I highly recommend you check out. And this is also represented in more specific terms if you're talking about an omnibenevolent God, with the problem of evil argument and the divine hiddenness argument. But none of that can conclusively prove that a God does not exist. It's merely fairly reasonable evidence to say that a God does not exist. Because there are also degrees of belief, right? You can be mostly agnostic but somewhat Gnostic, in that you haven't seen conclusive proof that no gods exist, but you've seen some indications that a God probably doesn't exist. Likewise, the problem with the evidences on the religious side is generally that while for the evidences on the side of a God not existing, these things are examples of things that are better explained under naturalism and that are improbable given a God. When theists try to give evidence, these things generally also are things that are better explained by naturalism, even though they're not necessarily improbable given a God. And this is the difference between evidence that's not evidence for a proposition and evidence that's against a proposition. The evidence that an atheist is providing against the existence of a God is evidence that is actively less probable given a God hypothesis than given a naturalistic hypothesis. Whereas the evidence that theists are providing is merely better explained by a naturalistic hypothesis. But this can be due to equal predictive power or a difference in priors, where priors are often set based on metaphysical commitment, Occam's razor, and the actual evidence for the existence of such mechanisms as well. So I think that's all I really wanted to say in this video. Thank you for watching or listening, and bye.